The charity my parents run provides life-saving organ transplants for the poor. I found the donor list. The organs are not donated. They're bought. It wasn't a piece of paper. It was a file, buried deep in my father's laptop, in a folder cryptically labeled Logistics. I was only on his computer to find a photo for my sister Maya's birthday slideshow, some old picture of us at the lake. But my curiosity got the better of me. Logistics. It sounded so boring, so corporate. My parents' work, the work of the Renewal Foundation, was anything but boring. It was miracles and second chances. It was tearful testimonials at black tie galas and my mother's elegant hands clutching an award for humanitarianism. Logistics didn't fit, so I clicked. And there it was. A spreadsheet titled Acquisition Ledger. My breath caught in my throat. The air in my father's study, usually smelling of old leather and his faint, clean cologne, suddenly felt thick and suffocating. The columns were neatly organized: recipient name, requirement, source ID, and the last one, the one that made the room spin, acquisition cost. The numbers were astronomical: $75,000, $120,000, $200,000 for a pediatric heart. My mind scrambled for an explanation. It had to be transport fees, surgical team costs, administrative overhead. It had to be. But the heading was clear: acquisition cost. You don't acquire a donation. You acquire a product. You acquire property. I scrolled, my finger trembling on the trackpad. Hundreds of names. Names I recognized from the Foundation's newsletters, the smiling faces of people given a new lease on life. And next to each of their names was a source ID, a string of letters and numbers, and a price tag. A price tag for a human kidney, for a liver, for a pair of lungs that are right now breathing inside a grandmother in Ohio who sent our family a Christmas card every year. The card sits on our mantle. It says, "To the Hayes family, my angels on earth." I felt a wave of nausea so intense, I had to grip the edge of the heavy oak desk to keep from falling. My angels. My parents. The people who taught me the value of charity, of giving without expectation of reward. My whole life has been shaped by the Renewal Foundation. I grew up stuffing envelopes for fundraising mailers, smiling for photo ops with grateful families, and feeling a swell of pride whenever my father, Dr. Alistair Hayes, was interviewed on the local news. He was the brilliant surgeon, the steady hand. My mother, Evelyn, was the face. Charming, articulate, impossibly beautiful, and persuasive. Together, they were a force for good, a beacon in a dark world. Our house, this beautiful, sprawling home in the greenest part of the city, was a testament to their success. But looking around the study now, at the framed photos and the shelves of medical journals, I saw it all for what it was: a monument built on a foundation of lies. Every comfortable chair, every piece of art on the wall, every tuition payment for my university education, it was all paid for by this. I could hear Maya laughing downstairs, the muffled sound of some dumb comedy show she was watching. She's 17. She worships them. She wants to be just like Mom, running a nonprofit, changing the world. She still believes in the fairy tale. The thought of her finding out of that pure, uncomplicated adoration in her eyes turning to ash was a physical pain in my chest. What was I supposed to do? Walk downstairs and shatter her entire world? Confront the two people I've loved and respected more than anyone on the planet? Accuse them of being monsters in bespoke suits and evening gowns? My hands moved on their own, pulling my phone from my pocket. I angled it at the screen, my thumb hovering over the button. The silence in the house was absolute, broken only by the frantic pounding of my own heart. I took a picture. The click of the digital shutter sounded like a gunshot. Then another, and another. I documented the evidence, the endless scroll of names and numbers, my stomach twisting with every tap. I closed the file, navigated back to the photos folder, and closed the laptop, placing it back on the desk at the exact angle I'd found it. My movements felt robotic, detached, like I was watching someone else in a movie. Back in my room, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling. The faint laughter from the TV downstairs felt like it was coming from a different lifetime. Every memory was now tainted, every act of their kindness suspect. I remembered my father, years ago, telling me why they started the foundation. "Everyone deserves a chance to live, Liam," he'd said, his hand on my shoulder. "Rich or poor, it shouldn't matter. We just level the playing field." The words echoed in my head, mocking me. They weren't leveling the field. They were just creating a new, secret market on it, one where the desperate sold pieces of themselves so that others could live. And my family, my angels on earth, were the brokers. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't look them in the eye at breakfast tomorrow and pretend I didn't know. The spreadsheet was damning, but it wasn't the whole story. It was just the receipts. I needed to see the factory. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had to go to the Foundation's downtown clinic. Not the pristine front office where my mother held meetings, but the medical wing. I had to see where the acquisitions were made. Sleep was impossible. The idea of it was almost insulting. How could I rest when my entire reality had been dismantled in the span of a few minutes? Every creak of the old house, every distant siren felt like a countdown. My father's words about the clinic echoed in my head, a conversation from a few years back when I had asked why they didn't just partner with a major hospital. "Control, Liam," he said, his voice calm and reasonable. "We need to oversee every step of the process to ensure the highest standards of care. Our patients deserve a dedicated, private facility." Now I understood what control really meant. It meant controlling the inventory. It meant keeping the supply chain hidden from view. I slipped out of bed, my movements slow and deliberate, a thief in my own home. I pulled on a dark hoodie and jeans, grabbed my wallet and keys, and crept toward the door. As I passed Maya's room, I could hear the soft, even rhythm of her breathing. A lump formed in my throat, hot and tight. I was doing this for her, I told myself, to protect the last bit of innocence in this family. But it felt like a betrayal, all the same. The drive downtown was a blur. The familiar streets of our neighborhood, with their perfectly manicured lawns and warm, glowing windows, felt like a movie set. It was all a facade, a beautiful lie paid for by the desperation of others. As I got closer to the city center, the landscape changed. The trees thinned out, replaced by concrete and steel. The Renewal Foundation Clinic was in a refurbished brick building, nestled between a law office and a high-end condo development. The front entrance, the one I knew, was all glass and brushed steel with a tastefully backlit logo. It looked clean, hopeful, and expensive. I drove past it, circling the block to the rear alley. Here, there was no pretense. Just a gray metal door, a loading dock, and a single flickering fluorescent light that cast long, distorted shadows. This was the entrance to the medical wing. A small keypad was mounted next to the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. I closed my eyes, picturing my father leaving for a late-night emergency consultation. The code. He'd punched it 100 times. His birthday. 0814. My hands shook as I typed the numbers. A green light blinked, and with a heavy electric buzz, the lock disengaged. The hallway was stark white, the floors a polished gray linoleum that squeaked under my sneakers. It was unnervingly quiet, the silence broken only by the low, constant hum of what I assumed were medical-grade refrigerators. I followed the hum down the hall, my own breathing sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. I passed doors labeled pre-op, recovery, and surgical suite 1. They were all dark. My goal wasn't to see the operating room. I knew what happened in there. I needed to find the paperwork, the human element, the proof that this wasn't just a list of numbers. I found a door marked records, and my breath hitched. It was unlocked. Inside, the humming was louder. One wall was lined with filing cabinets, the kind you see in a doctor's office, But on the other side of the room was a bank of humming, industrial-looking freezers, sub-zero storage. I didn't let my mind linger on what they might be for. The cabinets were labeled by year. I pulled open the current year's drawer, my fingers tracing over the neat tabs. They weren't organized by recipient name. The labels were strings of letters and numbers, source IDs. They matched the ones on the spreadsheet. I pulled one out at random. The file was thick. It wasn't the sanitized, feel-good profile of a grateful recipient. This was different. The first page was a medical history, terrifyingly thorough. Blood type, tissue match results, psychological evaluation. And then stapled to the inside cover was a passport-sized photo of a young man, not much older than me, with tired eyes and a forced smile. His name was Javier. The next few pages were financial documents, bank statements showing a balance of less than $50, eviction notices, a letter from a collections agency regarding his mother's medical debt, and then the last page, a contract, a meticulously detailed legal document full of clauses and subclauses, but the core of it was sickeningly simple. In exchange for a sum of $65,000, not the $75,000 listed on the acquisition cost ledger, I noted with a fresh wave of disgust, Javier would voluntarily undergo a nephrectomy. He was selling his kidney. He wasn't a donor. He was a vendor. And my parents, the city's great humanitarians, were the buyers. My fingers went numb holding the file. Javier. He had a name. He had a face. He wasn't a source or an acquisition. He was a person, backed into a corner so tight he had to sell a part of his own body to get out. The $65,000 felt like an insult. The $75,000 on my father's spreadsheet felt like a crime on top of a crime. $10,000. Where did it go? Was that my father's finder's fee? A little bonus skimmed from a man's desperation, used to pay for our family dinners, for Maya's riding lessons, for the very clothes on my back? The thought was so vile it made my stomach turn. I felt a hot surge of bile in the back of my throat and had to swallow hard, my eyes stinging. I carefully placed Javier's file back in its slot, my movements stiff and robotic as if I was handling something radioactive. My hand moved on its own, pulling out another file, then another. The source IDs blurred together, but the faces were sharp and clear, a haunting gallery of quiet panic. A woman named Althea, a single mother with a daughter who had leukemia, selling a portion of her liver. Her file included a tear-strained letter, a desperate plea to the foundation's review board to be considered. A young man from Eastern Europe named Stefan. His photo showing a kid barely out of his teens trying to get enough money to bring his family over. His contract was for bone marrow, a renewable resource, but the price was still life-altering for him and pocket change for the recipient. Each file was a self-contained tragedy, a story of a life derailed by circumstances, of people forced to make an impossible choice.
And my parents were the ones holding the pen, offering the only way out they could see. They weren't saviors. They were predators, circling the wounded, their smiles and charity galas just sophisticated camouflage. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it all was overwhelming. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was a business model. The psychological evaluations weren't to ensure the donors were of sound mind. They were to ensure they were desperate enough to go through with it and broken enough not to make a fuss later. The meticulous financial records weren't for accounting, they were leverage. It was all designed to be clean, efficient, and utterly heartless. I couldn't just walk away from this. I couldn't go back home and pretend this room didn't exist. Knowing wasn't enough. The spreadsheet on my laptop could be dismissed as a mistake, a fabrication. But these files, these faces, these signatures on the dotted line, this was the truth. I had to take it with me. My phone felt heavy and cold in my hand as I pulled it from my pocket. The screen flared to life, casting a ghostly blue light on the rows of filing cabinets. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to open the camera app. I slid Javier's file out again. The flash was off, thank God. I held the phone as steady as I could, centering the passport photo in the frame. The soft click of the digital shutter sounded like a firecracker in the humming silence. I took a picture of his tired eyes, then the first page of the contract, then the bank statement with its damningly low balance. I worked with a frantic, desperate energy, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I moved to the next file, Althea's. I photographed her face, her letter, the clause in her contract specifying the exact percentage of her liver to be resected. Each photo felt like a small act of rebellion, a tiny piece of evidence I was stealing back from the darkness. I fell into a grim rhythm. Slide open the drawer, pull a file, open, photograph the face, photograph the debt, photograph the signature, close, replace, slide the drawer shut. I was so consumed by the task, by the parade of haunted faces scrolling across my phone screen, that the first sound from the hallway barely registered. It was a low thud, like something heavy being set down. I froze for a second, then dismissed it. The building systems, maybe. The ice maker in a break room. I went back to work, my fingers flying across the screen. Then I heard it again, closer this time. The unmistakable electronic buzz of the alley door's lock, followed by the heavy groan of the door itself swinging open. My blood ran cold. Footsteps, 2 sets of them, echoing on the linoleum floor. And voices, muffled, but getting closer. One of them was low and calm. It was my father's. My heart didn't just stop, it seized. It was a block of ice in my chest, and the hum of the freezers was suddenly the only sound in the universe. For a split second, I was a statue. My phone clutched in my hand, Althea's tear-stained letters still illuminated on the screen. Then, instinct, raw and primal, took over. I didn't think, I just moved. My thumb mashed the power button, plunging the screen into darkness. I gently, silently slid the file drawer closed. The soft snick of the latch was deafening. The footsteps were in the main hallway now, slow and deliberate. There was nowhere to go. The door was the only way in or out. My eyes darted around the sterile room, landing on the bank of industrial freezers. There was a gap, a narrow, dusty space between the last freezer and the concrete wall, maybe 1.5 feet wide. It wasn't a hiding place. It was a coffin, but it was the only option I had. I squeezed myself into the opening, my back scraping against the rough wall, the icy metal of the freezer leaching warmth from my side. The motor vibrated through my bones, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to sync up with the frantic pounding in my ears. The door to the records room swung open with a soft sigh of its hydraulic closer. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered on, casting a stark, unforgiving glare. I held my breath, pressing myself flatter against the wall, trying to shrink, to become invisible. I could see a slice of the room through the gap. First, my father's shoes. Polished, expensive Italian leather, the same shoes he wore to parent-teacher conferences. Then a second pair. Worn-out work boots, scuffed at the toe, the laces frayed. The 2 men walked into the center of the room, and their voices were clear now, echoing slightly in the cold space. The other man's voice was tight with anxiety, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "It's a lot of money," he said, the words catching in his throat. "My wife, the doctor said—" His voice trailed off, thick with a grief I was becoming all too familiar with. "It is," my father replied, his tone smooth and reassuring, the same one he used with wealthy donors at his galas. "And it will solve your problem, Mr. Sokolov. Think of it not as a loss, but as a transaction, a transfer of assets. You have something we need, and we have something you need. It's the purest form of commerce, really." A transfer of assets. The phrase hung in the air, cold and sharp as a scalpel. He was talking about a piece of a man's body, a living, vital part of him, as if it were a stock or a bond. I risked a glance, peering around the edge of the freezer. I could see them now. My father stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a portrait of calm authority. Facing him was a man, Mr. Sokolov, who looked like he was crumbling from the inside out. He was thin, with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes, his hands twisting the brim of a worn baseball cap over and over again. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week.
He looked exactly like the photos in the files. "We have the recipient ready," my father continued, his voice dropping into a more conspiratorial, businesslike tone. "A perfect match. The preliminary tests were excellent. All that's left is your final consent and the scheduling. Dr. Evans can have you in by Tuesday." My father gestured towards the bank of filing cabinets, the very ones I had been rifling through just moments before. My blood turned to ice water. He was walking towards me. Each step was a hammer blow to my chest. "Let me just pull your file," he said casually. "We'll go over the final contract, make sure you understand every clause. We pride ourselves in transparency." The hypocrisy was so profound it was almost dizzying. Transparency? He was a monster cloaked in legal jargon and a bespoke suit. Mr. Sokolov just nodded mutely, his eyes fixed on the floor. I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. The drawer. Did I close it all the way? Did I put Althea's file back in the right place? Was there anything out of order? Anything that would give me away? The phone in my pocket suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. What if I got a text? What if the screen lit up? My hand trembled as I reached into my pocket, my fingers fumbling for the volume buttons, pressing them down until I felt the telltale vibration of silent mode engaging. I could hear the metallic slide of a drawer opening. It wasn't the one I had been in. It was from the cabinet closer to the door. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my lungs aching. "Here we are," my father said, the rustle of paper. "Sokolov, Ivan." He was holding a file, just like the others. I watched, frozen in my cramped, cold hiding spot as my father opened it on top of a filing cabinet. He presented it to the broken man standing before him as if it were a golden opportunity, a winning lottery ticket. "The payment will be wired to your account in 2 installments," my father explained, his finger tracing a line on the page. "Half upon completion of the procedure, the other half after the mandatory 2-week recovery observation period. It's all standard." He was a salesman, that's all he was. A predator who had perfected his pitch, who knew exactly which buttons to push, which fears to leverage. And I, his daughter, was hiding behind a freezer just a few feet away, clutching the digital proof of his monstrous, thriving business. His hand moved from the paper, resting on the cold metal top of the filing cabinet right next to my head. The sound of his knuckles tapping on the surface, a light, impatient rhythm, felt like he was knocking on my skull. The tapping stopped. I heard the crisp snap of the file being closed. My father's voice, now devoid of its false warmth, became purely functional. "The contract is straightforward, Yvonne. We cover all medical expenses, yours and the recipient's. We provide post-operative care for a period of 6 months. In exchange, you agreed to the non-disclosure clause and the terms of compensation we discussed." He slid the papers across the top of the cabinet. "Just need your signature on the bottom of each page." I could hear the faint, shaky exhale from Mr. Sokolov. It was the sound of a man standing on a ledge, steeling himself for the jump. "My wife, she will be okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was the plea of a man who had already lost everything, but was still trying to bargain with the devil. "The funds will be in her treatment account within the hour," my father said, the promise delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You are giving her the greatest gift imaginable. You're a hero, Yvonne." A hero. The word was a poisoned dart. He was twisting this man's desperation into a narrative of noble sacrifice. My father wasn't just buying a kidney, he was buying the man's story, reframing it so that Mr. Sokolov could live with the choice he was being forced to make. It was a level of psychological manipulation that was so profound, so chilling, it made my stomach churn. I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat and had to swallow it down, the acidic burn a stark contrast to the freezing air. The hum of the freezer against my back suddenly felt like a living thing, its vibrations a low growl of warning. I heard the click of a pen, a cheap one, not my father's usual gold-plated fountain pen. He must have pulled it from a drawer. The sound of it scratching across the paper was agonizingly slow. Each stroke was a piece of Mr. Sokoloff being signed away. I couldn't watch. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on the sounds. The scratch of the pen, the heavy, ragged breathing of the man signing, and the almost imperceptible, satisfied sigh from my father. "Excellent," my father said, his voice brisk again. Business was concluded. "We'll get these filed, and then I'll walk you down to the pre-op suite. Dr. Evans likes to have our donors settled the night before. Helps calm the nerves." He was moving again. I heard him slide the drawer shut on the filing cabinet he'd been using. Then his footsteps moved away from me toward the door. I felt a sliver of hope, a tiny, foolish spark. They were leaving. I just had to stay here, stay silent for a few more minutes, and I'd be clear. I listened to their footsteps retreat, the scuff of the work boots and the confident click of the Italian leather shoes. They reached the door. I heard the handle turn, and then they stopped. The silence stretched, taut and thin. It was a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't empty, it was heavy with unspoken thought. "You know," my father said, his voice casual but with a new edge to it that I couldn't quite place. "I just remembered."
I left my tablet in here this afternoon. Must have set it down when I was talking with maintenance about this freezer. My heart didn't just drop, it evaporated. This freezer, the one I was pressed against. It's been making a rattling noise, he continued, his voice getting closer again. He was walking back into the room. Can't have a multi-$1,000 piece of equipment failing, not with what we keep in them. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. He was walking directly towards me. I could see his polished shoes re-enter my sliver of vision. He was standing right in front of the bank of freezers, right in front of me. I flattened myself against the concrete, trying to melt into the wall, trying to stop breathing, to stop existing. He placed a hand on the freezer door, right next to the gap. I could feel the pressure through the metal. He was leaning on it, peering at the small gap between the unit and the wall, my hiding spot, my coffin. "Damn dust," he muttered to himself. "Have to get the cleaning crew to be more thorough back here." His face was inches from mine, separated only by a foot of shadow and a thin metal panel. If he just leaned a little further, if he just tilted his head, it would all be over. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my vision starting to prickle with black dots at the edges. I could smell the stale, metallic scent of the freezer unit mixed with the faint, expensive cologne my father wore. It was a smell I used to associate with safety, with him coming home from work and hugging me, but now it was the smell of the hunter closing in on its prey. He shifted his weight, and the pressure of his hand against the freezer door intensified. I could feel the minute vibrations of his movement through the steel, through my spine, a direct connection to the man who was unknowingly inches from destroying my life. My entire world had shrunk to this sliver of dusty, freezing darkness. My only reality was the frantic, silent prayer that he would just move, just turn around, just forget about the damn dust and the non-existent tablet. From the doorway, there was a sound. A wet, ragged cough that echoed slightly in the concrete room. It was Mr. Sokoloff. He coughed again, a deep, rattling noise that spoke of sick lungs and a lifetime of worry. My father's head snapped up. The pressure of his hand vanished from the freezer door as he straightened to his full height. The shadow of his face disappeared from the gap. "You all right there, Ivan?" he asked, his voice losing its casual, musing tone and becoming sharp with impatience. He turned away from me, taking a step toward the door. The wave of relief that washed over me was so powerful it was nauseating. My muscles, locked tight for what felt like an eternity, began to tremble uncontrollably. I had to bite down on my own tongue to keep my teeth from chattering, the coppery taste of blood, a shocking, grounding sensation. "Just a cold," Mr. Sokoloff rasped from the doorway. "Forgive me." My father made a dismissive sound. "Right. Well, the tablet can wait. Let's get you settled in." He didn't even glance back. He was already done with this room. His mind moved on to the next item on his checklist. He walked over to Ivan, placing a hand on his shoulder and a gesture that was meant to look reassuring, but was really just a way to steer him out of the room. I listened to their footsteps recede once more.
The heavy door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss, and I heard the solid, definitive click of the electronic lock engaging. Silence. A profound, echoing silence that was louder than the hum of the freezer. I was alone. For a full minute, I didn't move. I just stayed pressed against the wall, listening to the frantic drumbeat of my own heart. Then the shaking started for real, a violent, full-body tremor I couldn't control. I unfolded myself from the cramped space, my knees buckling as I stood. My legs were numbed, pins and needles. My back ached from the cold metal, and a sob caught in my throat, raw and painful. I stumbled away from the freezers, leaning against the opposite wall, just trying to breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. I looked at the filing cabinet where he'd signed the papers. A cheap, disposable pen still lay there, a life bartered away with a throwaway instrument. The sight of it made me want to be sick. I had to get out. I had to get out before my courage evaporated completely, before he decided to come back for his fictional tablet. My escape from the basement was a frantic, clumsy blur. I fumbled with the key card, my shaking hands making it impossible to slide it smoothly. I kept glancing back at the freezer room door, half expecting it to swing open. Every hum of the building's ventilation, every distant noise from the floors above, sounded like his footsteps returning for me. When I finally made it back to the ground floor and pushed through the side exit into the cold night air, the gasp I took was ragged and desperate. The damp, chilled air felt clean, pure. It was the air of the real world, a world away from that sterile, cold tomb and the monstrous business conducted within it. I ran to my car, my keys digging into my palm, not stopping until I was inside, the doors locked, the engine on. I just sat there in the driver's seat, shaking, my forehead pressed against the cold steering wheel, replaying the last 10 minutes over and over in my head. The image of Ivan Sokolov's face, pale and defeated under the fluorescent lights, was burned into my memory. He wasn't just a name on a list anymore. He was a real person, a man with a sick wife, a man my father had called a hero while stripping him of his dignity and a piece of his body. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb hovering over the screen. The files were still there. The pictures I had taken. Althea. The rows of names. They all had faces now. They were all Ivan Sokolov, standing on a ledge, being told what a hero they were for jumping. A cold, hard certainty began to crystallize in my chest, pushing past the fear. This wasn't just about exposing my parents. It was about them. It was about the people whose lives they were consuming to fuel their pristine reputation. My fear wasn't gone, but it had a new companion now. Rage. A quiet, focused anger that gave me a clarity I hadn't had before. I couldn't go to the police. My parents' money and influence were a fortress. I needed to find a crack in the wall, a different way in. I scrolled through the photos on my phone, past the spreadsheets and donor profiles, until I found Althea's file again. I zoomed in on the section marked Next of Kin. A name, a relationship, Liam Reyes, brother. And next to it, a phone number. I stared at the string of digits, my heart beginning to pound again, but for a different reason. This wasn't fear. It was resolve. He deserved to know. They all deserved to know the truth about the charity that had taken their loved ones. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I moved my thumb over the screen and pressed the call button. The electronic tone drilled into my ear, once, twice, a shrill digital sound that felt completely alien in the enclosed space of my car. Each ring was a lifetime, a window of opportunity to hang up, to throw the phone out the window and drive until I ran out of gas, to pretend the last 10 minutes never happened. But my thumb was frozen, locked in place by a force stronger than my fear. On the fourth ring, just as I was starting to think it would go to voicemail, there was a click. A man's voice, rough with sleep, or maybe just weariness, answered. Hello? My own voice was a stranger's, a thin, reedy thing that cracked on the first word. Is this Liam Reyes? There was a pause on the other end, a beat of suspicious silence.
I could picture him on the other end, sitting up in bed, squinting at the unfamiliar number on his screen. "Who's asking?" he said, his tone instantly guarded. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "My name is... It doesn't matter. Not right now. I need to talk to you. It's about your sister, Althea." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was heavy, weighted with grief and a new shark-edged curiosity. "My sister is dead," he said flatly, the words like stones. "Who the hell is this? Is this some kind of sick joke?" No, God, no. Please, don't hang up," I pleaded, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Please, just give me 1 minute. I know how this sounds, I know it's insane, but I have information about what happened to her, about the foundation." I used their name, the official, benevolent name of my parents' charity. It was the only hook I had. I heard him take a sharp breath. "The foundation?" "They were very kind to my family. They handled everything." His voice was tight, defensive, but he hadn't hung up. "They told you she was in a car accident, right? They said she was a registered organ donor and her last act was to save lives." I was quoting directly from the file, from the script they used. The silence on the other end was a chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its defensive shell and was just raw. "How do you know that?" he whispered. "That's exactly what they said. Who are you?" This was it, the point of no return. "I have access to their records," I said, choosing my words carefully. "And the story they told you? It's not the whole story. Althea, the circumstances of her death are not what they seem. They lied to you, Liam." A harsh, disbelieving sound, almost a laugh, came through the phone. "Lied? I was there. I saw her. I identified her body at the morgue. It was an accident." His pain was a physical thing, something I could feel through the phone. And I felt a fresh wave of sickness at what I was doing to him, at what I was about to make him relive. "I know. I'm so sorry," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a cocktail of guilt and pity and white-hot fury at my parents for making this necessary. But they control the narrative. They control the paperwork, the reports, everything. I have proof. I have documents, pictures. They didn't just take her organs because she was a donor. They took her for her organs. The words hung in the air between us, monstrous and unbelievable. I expected him to yell, to curse me out, to hang up. Instead, there was only the sound of his ragged breathing. He was listening. He was considering the impossible. And that was more than I had hoped for. "I don't understand," he said, his voice small, lost. "Why? Why would they do that?" And in that question, I heard the first crack in his certainty, the first seed of doubt I had so cruelly planted. "Money," I said, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "Reputation. Saving the wealthy and the well-connected by preying on people like your sister. People they think no one will miss or no one will question." I let that sink in, let the horror of it take root. I can't explain everything over the phone. It's not safe, for either of us. But I can show you, I can prove it. You deserve to know the truth of what they did to her. I held my breath, waiting for his decision. The hum of my car's engine was the only sound in my world. He could destroy this whole thing with one word, by dismissing me as a crank and calling the police, or worse, the foundation itself. The seconds stretched into an eternity. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low, hard rasp. The single word was a capitulation, an alliance, a promise of shared peril. Relief washed over me so intensely it made me dizzy. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the Daily Grind coffee shop on Elm Street. It's public, it's safe. I'll be in a booth in the back. I'll have a laptop." He didn't say anything for a moment, and then a quiet, resigned, "Okay." He hung up without another word. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, my hand trembling. The reality of what I had just done crashed down on me. I had set a meeting,
I had brought a stranger, a grieving brother, into the heart of my family's darkness. There was no going back now. I had just declared war, and I had no idea if either of us would survive it. I spent the night in a cheap motel off the interstate, the kind with a buzzing neon sign that flickered through the thin curtains and painted the room in shades of sickly red. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Althea's smiling photo, then the cold clinical text of her file. I heard the dead tone of the phone line after Liam hung up. I had lit a fuse. I just had to pray the explosion wouldn't consume me along with everything else. I left before dawn, my laptop bag clutched to my chest like a shield. The coffee shop was warm and smelled of burnt sugar and roasted beans, a painfully normal setting for the conversation I was about to have. I chose a booth in the far back corner, my back to the wall, and ordered a coffee I knew I couldn't drink. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the ceramic mug with both of them just to keep it steady. He arrived at 8 o'clock on the dot. I knew it was him before he even saw me. He had the same tired, haunted eyes I'd heard in his voice, his shoulders slumped with a grief that had clearly never left him. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-20s, with calloused hands that suggested he worked a trade. He scanned the room, his gaze suspicious and wary, until it landed on me. For a moment, he just stood there, and I saw the conflict on his face, the desperate need to know warring with the instinct to run from a situation that screamed of danger and madness. Then he took a breath and walked towards my table, his steps heavy. He slid into the booth opposite me without a word, his eyes never leaving mine, searching for answers I didn't have. "You have one chance to convince me you're not crazy," he said, his voice low and rough. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I opened the laptop and turned it to face him. The first thing on the screen was Althea's file, her picture looking up at him. I saw his breath hitch, a flicker of raw pain crossing his face. I navigated with the trackpad, my finger trembling slightly. I showed him the intake form, the one marked with a small coded symbol in the corner that I now knew designated a procurement rather than a legitimate donation. I showed him the falsified police report, ghost written on official letterhead. Then I opened the financials. I showed him the line item, a 7-figure wire transfer from a shell corporation that coincided with the date of Althea's accident, and the corresponding entry in a separate ledger. Procurement complete, asset HLKR delivered. Heart, lungs, kidneys, liver. He stared at the screen, his face draining of all color. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared, his eyes tracing the cold, hard data that was systematically dismantling the reality he'd been living in for months. He reached out a hand as if to touch his sister's picture, but stopped, his fingers hovering over the screen. A single tear escaped his eye and tracked a slow, clean path down his cheek. When he finally looked up at me, the grief in his eyes was gone. It had been burned away, replaced by a cold, terrifying fury that mirrored my own. "They butchered her," he whispered, the words so quiet I almost didn't hear them. "They butchered my little sister for money." He finally looked away from the screen, his jaw tight. "Who are you?" he asked again, but this time the question was different. It wasn't accusatory. It was a plea. "Why are you showing me this?" "My parents run the foundation," I said, the confession tasting like poison. His eyes widened, a flash of pure hatred in them, and for a second I thought he might lunge across the table. But he held himself in check, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists on the table. I continued, my voice barely more than a whisper. "They think I don't know. They think I'm just their spoiled, oblivious child, but I found everything. Althea? She's not the only one. There are dozens, Liam, dozens of files just like hers." He closed his eyes, a strangled sound catching in his throat. We sat in silence for a long moment, the sounds of the coffee shop fading into a dull roar around us. We were two strangers in a bubble of shared horror. "The police won't help," he stated, not a question. "They own the police." I nodded. "They own everyone." He opened his eyes, the cold fury back, but now it was sharpened, honed to a fine point. "So what do we do?" That was the question I had been waiting for. the we. It meant I wasn't alone anymore. We don't go to the police, I said, leaning forward. We go to the press. I know a journalist, Alina Vance. She's a pit bull. She's won awards for taking down corrupt politicians and corporations. My parents have tried to sue her for old stories before. They hate her. She's the one person I know they can't buy or intimidate. I slid a thumb drive across the table. Everything is on there. Every file, every financial record, every hidden ledger. It's all copied. It's our only shot. He looked from the drive to my face, a silent, heavy assessment passing between us. He picked it up, its small plastic body looking insignificant in his large hand, yet holding the power to ruin an empire. Okay, he said, his voice firm, resolute. Let's go burn them to the ground. We left the coffee shop together, stepping out into the cold morning air. No longer just a grieving brother and a guilty daughter, but partners in a war we had no choice but to win. My old life was over, a ghost haunting the rearview mirror. My family was a casualty of a truth that had to be told. When the people you love are the monsters, do you have a duty to protect them or a duty to destroy them? Let us know in the comments.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new stories every day.